Go for it, Trey.
Well, so I'd like to first of all point out that I am actually in my office right now. So the ski season is over, and I am back to being a serious academic again as I drink my cider. So today we are going to talk to somebody, one of the first agronomists I met when I got to the state of Michigan. So Christy Apple is also known as the Cropscout Christy. She's really made a big push. She's kind of blowing up right now. She's been on like a million podcasts lately. Her Instagram account is super strong. She's doing a lot of stuff on Facebook. She's blogging. She's got like a lot of content that's coming out all the time. Definitely recommend following her. But the first time I met her was at the Hop and Barley conference a couple years ago. I was on crutches. I had just blown my Achilles, so I was hobbling around on crutches. And we ran this big experiment where we were testing to see if you could taste the difference between Michigan hopped beer and Washington hopped beer. And so, we got to talking, and, at that point in time, Christy, you were doing like mostly like what, hops and grapes and cherries?
Orchards. Yeah.
Yeah. Just orchards. So from that moment forward, it seems like you all of a sudden became like the hemp person in the state of Michigan.
One thing does lead to another.
So talk us through what that's like becoming like the, would you call yourself the hemp queen the other day?
I wouldn't call myself that, but I have been called that before.
Okay.
That was an interesting journey, not really having an exposure to commercialized production of cannabis prior to, say, 2018, I think. It was actually my hemp hops clients that I was consulting for at the time had started kind of picking my brain on, what would you do with this nutrient? I have this deficiency. This is what it looks like. And that was kind of pre-2018 Farm Bill being implemented here in Michigan. So it was a little bit behind closed doors. They definitely weren't growing hemp. But it opened the door for me to start diving into the agronomics of the cannabis plant at large. So I started my journey there, and many of the characteristics of a hemp plant are also exhibited in things like hops. Although they're different in a lot of ways, it was a relatively easy transition. What I realized as our farmers started cultivating hemp or were thinking about it, there really was no help for them to talk about nutrient management plans, pest management plans. I mean, these are, cash crop farmers trying to grow a horticultural crop and produce CBD hemp. And so that kind of opened the door for me to jump in and say, hey, we don't know everything. We haven't cultivated this in long enough for us to be able to have really good agronomics behind us like we do for your corn and soybean production. But here's what I know, and here's what I think we can do.
Okay, so let's take like a step back and explain exactly what your job looks like. So you're an agronomy consultant. Yes. I feel like anytime I see you on social media, you're like in some random place. So like yesterday you were at like, I think the Mackinac Bridge yesterday. The day before that, I feel like you were in Wisconsin or something. So what does that, do you just drive around all day? Is that what you do?
I think there are people that believe I do, but believe it or not, I actually do work. So what the agronomy gig really looks like is more or less a blending of the features and functions of the plant, how to produce the plant, the environmental and cultural factors that affect that production system, and then the products and application to get our production where we want to be. So those kind of like basic principles apply to any given crop that we're producing. If it's a permanent crop like an apple tree, or if it's an annual crop like a corn plant. So I do a lot of public speaking in that regard. You're right, Trey. I was at the Mackinac Bridge the other day. I also was in Wisconsin the other day. I do travel a lot, but it's because of the way that I present things and the relationships that I've built over time, building that trust factor with people, just being open and honest about what I can and can't do with them, I think has probably built the relationships that I have. I also work for a crop nutrient company called TMAC Agro USA. And so a lot of my travels have to do with representing that company and putting soil health solutions in front of farmers, such as seaweed extracts and nutritional products. So I have a lot of my day-to-day activity involves several different cropping systems. I interface with farmers directly. I interface with ag retailers directly. I support a sales force in the capacity of a product manager. So I'm their technical support for products and for agronomy, several different
I think
things.
what's super interesting is that you're kind of like, you cover a lot of the wild card stuff, right? So you've got like, there are agronomists who really focus on like corn, soybeans, and they kind of have like a really nice set of what they're kind of expecting to do every year. Where like for you, yeah, hops took off in Michigan, and so you were working on hops, and then all of a sudden hemp took off in Michigan / the Midwest, and next thing you know, you have to pivot and become like an expert on this new thing that nobody's been growing in the state of Michigan for 100 years.
Right.
Which I just think is super interesting, because it means you got to be on the ball for stuff that like that there isn't necessarily a playbook for.
That's very true. The playbook is very elusive for the crop, those two specifically. But I've really had a lot of fun too, building relationships and growing my depth and breadth in the vineyard realm as well as the orchard realm. I mean, I got my start in corn and soybeans. Row crop is where I came from as far as the agronomy goes. And so, over time, that's kind of evolved into things that are a little more challenging, and just being sort of fearless in that regard. I mean, keeping a humble spirit is really important, because the things that we don't know, you always have to have respect for that realm of what we don't know. What's happening inside of the box, all we can do is make assumptions based on the things that are happening in its environment. And so in that regard, having a profound respect for that has built into me, the willingness to just jump at it. I never dreamed, like when I was a little girl, dreaming about what I wanted to be when I grew up. I didn't say agronomist. That wasn't what I thought I was going to do when I got older. But here I am, having a ball, killing it, having fun, and building on my skill set and my strengths and weaknesses to do that. So, it's like, I get a lot of questions of, how do you get started? How do you become an agronomist? Well, it's a lifelong journey. It's not a destination.
Sure.
And people need to respect that. I can't, even if I go and get a degree that says I have these XXX credentials or whatever, still doesn't mean that I've arrived. So just staying in a place, staying humble and staying hungry has kept me going. Let's
talk about kind of what the Wild West of hemp has looked like in the last couple of years. Like take me from like when you and I met in 2018, I think, to now.
Yeah, so 2018 really, the 2018 Farm Bill is really what tore the lid off of industrial hemp. The 2014 Farm Bill was actually the original opportunity for states to adopt. But there was several states that, because it still wasn't federally descheduled, industrial hemp had not yet been federally descheduled as a class 1 controlled substance. That just created too much gray area. So there was a couple early adapters, California, Colorado, some in the Pacific Northwest there. And, they started to develop cannabis cultivation on a larger scale, but that was mainly the marijuana side of things. And then quietly under the radar is where hemp was starting to be cultivated. Some seeds were being put in the ground, and just that's kind of where that started. So when you and I met, that was, I was really hustling hard to build the relationships and understand my role in the hops industry here in Michigan and the Great Lakes at large, really. And that opened up the door for farmers to have the opportunity for cultivation. What happened, though, unfortunately, was kind of this CBD craze. Like, people went crazy about every aspect of it. We're going to make $20,000 an acre. We're going, this is going to be easy. We're going to plug it right into a system.
Hold on. I think we need to myth bust a little bit first. So what's the difference?
Before you do that, yeah, that's what I want to know.
Yeah.
What the heck is hemp? Like, you've been talking about cannabis, marijuana, and hemp. And then two of those things are pretty loaded words in my mind, whereas hemp is this sort of ambiguous thing that I don't actually know what it is. So what the heck is the difference between these things?
That's a fair question. And in fact, I get that question probably more so than any other question I've ever gotten on a regular basis in my life. Industrial hemp is a cannabis plant that is cultivated for a specific reason. And the difference between marijuana and cannabis, or marijuana and industrial hemp, even though it's technically the same plant, is the expression of a cannabinoid. Sorry for the big words here. I'll explain that in
Sure
a second.
enough.
Of the compound, the chemical compound within the plant called THC. THC is a psychoactive material that gets you, and I'm going to use air quotations here, high, or has a psychoactive effect on the brain. So the THC was really what defines it as marijuana versus CBD. We can extract CBD from all kinds of different plants. I can extract CBD from a marijuana plant. So those things coexist within the plant material. And so through an extraction process or consuming the plant material in different ways, you'll be able to have an effect on the body from that.
So one thing that I think is super interesting about all of that is that you have all of these cannabinoids that we don't really even know yet, because so you threw out something about the Schedule 1 listing, right? Yep. So we are so far behind in my mind on the research that needs to happen in this marketplace because of this Schedule 1 listing for so long. That I think we're going to see like this explosion in cannabis research in the next like 10 years. And
I would agree with that. I would agree with that, Trey. And there's something that, I mean, it's only been in the last probably 25 years that we've been able to associate what's really physiologically happening in the human body when cannabis is consumed in one form or another. And not to jump down a rabbit hole with all of this, but, doctors that went to MD school, in the 80s and 90s didn't hear about an endocannabinoid system. Okay. But all mammals have one. And the very concept of our human body having an endocannabinoid system, which is designed to process cannabinoids intentionally, that's part of the design of our body.
I don't know what is happening. That was like a 19-syllable word. So you're saying that we're learning not only in the production side how to kind of produce this stuff and produce it potentially safely, but also what it does on the other side, like the consumption side, what the endocannabinoid does in terms of like close. The human responses. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So part of this conversation about cannabinoids is interesting, and this is not something that agronomists typically talk about. Okay, so I'm one of the weird ones. I feel like I need to understand the industry better in order to be my best for my clients. And so in trying to educate myself about how to grow hemp and to do it on a field scale size, I felt like I needed to dive into this industry. So that's exactly what I did. And through this process, which is still ongoing, I've learned a ton about these different classifications of the cannabis plant and how these things are all interconnected. Like I said, I don't want to jump down a rabbit hole on the cannabinoid side, but I do want to explain that when we are producing these plants, industrial hemp for cannabinoids, what we're trying to do is create these compounds in the plant that we can extract and utilize for all kinds of different purposes. And so this is where, the Cbd craze, I guess you could say, came from.
I've been thinking about the CBD thing a lot because it blew up out of nowhere. I published a paper like a couple years ago on hemp because somebody asked me, what do we know and not know about hemp? And so I was kind of starting to pay attention to it. And then all of a sudden CBD was everywhere. You could buy CBD at like Family Video and the gas station. And like it was literally, but there was like basically no established peer-reviewed research on why people were buying it. It was like it's this story that like people will tell about that they got it for their pets. Pet food was a big one that took off. The tinctures and everything else. And but when you ask people, sometimes they'd say like stress relief or whatever. But the weird thing is the last year when personally speaking, I've been probably more stressed than I've ever been in one full year of my life. And I think a lot of people have too. demand for CBD, or at least at a minimum, like some like simple demand measures for CBD have kind of trailed off a little bit, which I think is like super interesting. That like people kind of talk about how they use it for stress relief, but when everybody's stressed, they tended to look for something else.
Right. And so like what is motivating buying choices? I mean, Trey, this is like, this is the world that you live in, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, one of the aspects or the ways that I have impacted this industry is to talk to farmers about how to do this the right way. And one of the challenges that we face is the agricultural sector who's going to be producing it in a way that's food safe and can be utilized for other things. And so I'm out there working with farmers to perfect the infield stuff. Simultaneously, the market is asking for different things because first of all, we're learning, we can see smaller and smaller every day. I mean, that's a scientific fact. And as the researchers and developers are going down rabbit holes with, you know, pharmaceutical competitive materials like this, you know, instead of taking something else, people might be trying cannabinoids to alleviate some other symptom versus going through the traditional routes. But there's so many questions to be answered in that, and there's so much research to be done there that, you know, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. And I see so much other potential for this plant that we're, you know, in 2019, we weren't even discussing. Like everything about hemp in 2019 was all about CBD, but you know, oh, by the way, there's also these other functions and there's also these other plant types.
So what were the things that like your growers were kind of like hitting a wall on with CBD at that point in time? I mean, you mentioned here intensive labor challenges. You know, what was horrible. This issue?
I think I mean, just the complete, utter, total lack of communication to begin with. I mean, there was seed companies that were, you know, let's host a meeting and talk about industrial hemp, get everybody excited and make some really, you know, ridiculous claims about potentially, you know, I literally heard numbers from $10,000 to $20,000 return on investment per acre. And nobody could ever do the math or show that to me on paper, like on a P&L or a balance sheet where that actually worked out. And part of the agronomy gig is to advocate for the economic viability or sustainability of a crop on somebody's farm. Sure. And, you know, so looking at these production systems that these folks are looking at, the seed material was garbage. There was absolutely no standards of seed material. When you're talking to a row crop farmer who's used to buying a bag of seed corn, refuge in a bag, pre-treated, you know, it's ready to go. It's 99.9% germination rate. And you sell them a bag of seed the size of my day planner here. It cost them $100,000 for this bag of seed. And you pat them on the back and wish them the best of luck. The only people that got rich in 2019 were the used car salesmen, seed slime balls that were slinging bad seeds.
I remember, I think it was 2019 that you took me out to a hemp farm, a couple of hemp farms actually, and we wandered around, and I remember thinking like, wow, there are a lot of male plants here, and that doesn't seem like a good thing.
Right. So, you know, that was one of the biggest challenges there. People were being told all kinds of different things. You want males in your field, you don't want males in your field. They're being told conflicting information every single turn. This is really what sparked my hunger for this industry, was because I wanted to myth bust. I wanted to provide results and to be a part of collecting data for these folks. There's, you know, we even at Michigan State and within the extension group, we have a phenomenal crops team that has done tremendous work in evaluating pesticides, evaluating nutrient applications, and providing growers with some SOP framework, you know, to develop a standard operating procedure for these different cropping systems. This didn't exist. Literally, Trey, you hit it on the head. It was the wild, wild west. And that's one thing that you can't develop a business model that way, right?
And
the biggest gunslinger is who's going to be left standing.
And I guess it's different for hemp than it is for the wild, wild west if this was corn, right? Because so my assumption here is you say males in the field. This means if the female plants get pollinated, that it turns into marijuana. Is that what we're talking about here?
Right. Or, I mean, yeah, so it can go hot. I mean, that's the industry term for going hot,
Yeah.
which makes it illegal. It's unfortunately that makes that field in 2019 not usable. So in 2020, I mean, now we have some different verbiage that kind of gives you some options for how to remediate that and different things. But at that time, that basically rendered it unusable. So there's a ton of conflicting information out there, and there's people that are coming from Kentucky, or they came from Oregon. A farmer paid them $20,000 to come and chat with the farm for a couple of hours as a consultant. He gives them not a lot of information, cashes the check, and off into the sunset. And so, like, we're really, I put out a lot of miles in 2019 just chasing down bad information for farmers. And when we realized, what's at risk if we have this pollination, one of the big concerns with open pollination for industrial hemp is for the medical marijuana producers that are down the road and are operating legally and have a small outdoor grow. Their medical marijuana that they're using for caregiving and distributing for caregiving under legal terms is potentially being openly pollinated by this other, subset of hemp that maybe has traits that they don't want, or is going to create something that was unpredictable. And when you're talking about a caregiving situation, quality control is really critical. And I have a lot of respect for the medical marijuana producers that really put that at the forefront of their business model. So bringing industrial hemp on a field scale was a very scary concept for these guys. I mean, it was interesting. I didn't even have a context for that until I got out in the field and I started doing this work and realizing, there's some really interesting things here.
So my understanding is, so when you took me out, so we went to one guy that really seemed like he was probably a row crop guy. Like, I mean, I think there was corn in the next field over.
Yeah.
And my impression is that, like, if you're growing for CBD, that's more like growing almost like tomatoes or like some type of horticultural product. Whereas like these folks are coming from this completely different angle where they're not used to this type of concern and care, labor. So you had that guy. And then we went to a greenhouse that was trying to pivot away from, I think it was poinsettias, and like just trying to find something else. But that system was completely different.
Very different.
And yet, like, in my head, I kept thinking, like, wow, this is interesting that the systems are completely different, but they're trying to sell into the same marketplace, which was the CBD marketplace, right?
That is true.
Do I have that right?
That is true. Yeah. Both of those scenarios were marketing their product into the CBD marketplace. Although they produced widely differing quality.
Sure.
One was able to produce a smokable flower product that's consumed much more like your traditional marijuana consumption. The other, the field scale, where they had, you can't prevent the birds from dropping on the field. You can't prevent the wind from blowing across the field. There's some other things that on a large scale field scale production, you really can't control those factors, those environmental factors that push your product maybe out of spec to be consumed in that way. So in the meantime, the market is trying to figure out what it's going to do and how much does smokable flower go for versus, a whole plant biomass extracted into oil that's converted into a tincture. Like, what are those things valued at? There's a ton of factors that play into that. And simultaneously to that, we have Colorado and Oregon and these other places in the world that are producing such higher quality material that, do we really need Michigan to be online producing this? The answer was actually probably not, frankly.
Well, once you could ship across state lines, right? But that gets to this other piece, right? That like there are these regulations that almost were like inducing this massive push to hemp.
It truly was. And one of the factors that, really kind of, I mean, for me, opened my eyes was, if there are other purposes for industrial hemp, and there's these other cultivars that are better geared for what these cultural practices are for this farm anyway. Why is a row cropper trying to grow a horticultural crop that's highly labor intensive, that, you know, thrives in these other types of environments? Why aren't we growing for some of these other purposes? And that's one of the things that I like to, you know, really share about these days is, you know, there's other hemp plants, plant architecture. It looks very different. We plant it very different. It has a ton of, you know, these cultural practice differences to cultivate it. And, you know, there's opportunities that are better geared for a row cropper there. You know, so our cannabinoid production.
I got a dumb question for you that is going to show you that I'm not an agronomist. Okay, so I know that the official term or the formal term is cultivar for like a different variety or strain.
Correct.
Is there but I've heard people talk about in cannabis like strains too. Is basically a strain a cultivar?
Yeah, strains are more or less hybrids. So when somebody creates a strain of this, they're crossing these genetics with these genetics, but they're still within the same family. The way that we
so that would be a cultivar then?
Not necessarily. I mean, people are very possessive about their strains, but they're, you know, they're certainly, there's a very, very small group of cannabis cultivar production folks that are doing that work. Everybody else is kind of harvesting seed and doing it themselves, more or less. You know, but this past year has really brought out a new level of quality control in the seed side of things. So we have a lot less off-typing than what we saw in 19, right? We saw a ton of off-type. We bought the cherry wine cultivar, and then we see 10 different phenotypes, which is like the physical characteristics of these plants look very different, which you saw, Trey, when we were in the field. It was all the same seed, and we literally saw 10 different styles of plants or leaf architecture or branch structure. And that's just because the seed quality was relatively low, and the standards, well, there really weren't any standards.
So then from there, this is where I'm wanting to go next, is that you have these strains or cultivars that are for cannabinoids or CBD and all that stuff, but then you also have like, so it would be like you grow another cultivar if you're going to try to move to a different market.
Hold on. So yeah, but are these so hemp for grain or hemp for fiber versus CBD, are these co-products or are these either or? Like, can I get some CBD out of this and sell for the grain market, or is it just one or the other?
So if I am purchasing a cultivar that is a CBD heavy cultivar, chances are the plant architecture is going to be much more like the little Christmas tree style plants that you would normally associate in your head immediately, right? But if I'm growing for grain or fiber, I am going to get some CBD quality out of that, and maybe some other minor cannabinoids as well. So if I'm growing a cultivar that's CBD heavy, I'm going to have very little plant material left behind that has value for anything else. I don't want the grain, right? So if I end up with seeds created in my plants, it's because I've been pollinated, which drives down my total CBD quality and potentially drives up my THC quality. So that's not really, I don't want my CBD cultivar to pollinate, but I do want my grain cultivar to pollinate. And then I can harvest the head for grain, and then I can harvest the rest of the plant material and extract a small amount of CBD, which can still be utilized. So one doesn't go this way, but the other two do go the other way. Does that make sense, Al?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, so the grain market space, I think, is better geared for that broadacre row crop farmer. You can harvest it with equipment you probably already have in the shed. You know, a traditional grain table. There's some nuance to the way that you would want to, you know, manage your rotor speed and your concaves and all the things, the buttons and knobs that you would turn on a combine to make it work for you. But you would also be able to harvest the other plant byproducts to create other things with it. So our grain tends to be, you know, kind of human consumption, hemp hearts, pressed oil for cooking with or consuming, you know, that type of thing. An up and coming component of this grain, the hemp grain industry, is reintroducing industrial hemp into the livestock feed mix. There was a time in our country when farms were all producing industrial hemp, right? So, I mean, there's a couple of eras of our American history where hemp was really at the forefront. And, you know, at one point in time, especially during the early colonization era, the Native Americans that existed all over, you know, the Eastern Seaboard were producing industrial hemp for lots of different purposes. They were producing not for CBD specifically, but they were utilizing the grain for themselves and utilizing that in the food chain. They were utilizing the plant material for other extracts and poultices. And then they were using what's left of the plant material for all kinds of other things, textiles. The interior of the plant is very, very valuable for the textile market, to create things like rope and sails and just a plethora of uses there.
So, but then you had this like massive change, right, in the history of the United States, where you had like the Eli Whitney cotton gin. All of a sudden, cotton prices came down pretty low, and so like there was an easy substitution that happened, you know. Right. And so now, like you mentioned here in your slide here about supply chain challenges, you know, we're basically starting from the ground up on some of these supply chain issues.
Yes. We truly are. And part of that is because industrial hemp had fallen victim to this era of prohibition, because of its becoming part of that Schedule 1. And there's a little bit of a backstory behind that. So there was, you know, like 200 years where virtually every farm in America was producing some amount of hemp. And there's places in Pennsylvania that where every farm was producing, you know, there's counties in PA, there's counties in Virginia, and the Delmarva area that everybody produced hemp, even as recent as 100 years ago. But with the onset of, you know, there's a little campaign in the 30s. So they were trying to create this taxation system and make, you know, marijuana part of, or hemp part of this, you know, extremely high tax, so that people would stop using it to self-medicate. This was also kind of in that era of alcohol prohibition as well. So there was just this huge movement to eliminate anything that would, you know, that would ease the minds of the people. And you know, whatever, it is what it was. So that was in 1937. But during the World War II era, there was the Hemp for Victory campaign, right, which reignited this, you know, cultivating industrial hemp for grain and fiber purposes. So, you know, we had this little resurgence around the wartime efforts. And then relatively quickly, what they found was the law enforcement of that era was not able to distinguish between industrial hemp and marijuana. So they're still running into the problems that they were having during the Prohibition era. So they just continued to make it harder and harder to make that happen. It wasn't until 1970 that industrial hemp was technically thrown under that Schedule 1 umbrella. And by that time, we were just starting to be able to disseminate how to distinguish hemp from marijuana. But as time's gone on, we can see smaller and smaller. So
just clarify a little bit why Schedule 1 matters. Like what is that even, like what is a schedule?
So Schedule 1 is part of the law enforcement tier system of how to enforce like narcotics and controlled substances. So what they were trying to do was make it so that the government was controlling the access to that. So you had to have certain licenses, you know, even, you know, doctors have to have certain licenses and credentials to be able to prescribe certain things. And so industrial hemp was falling under the same umbrella as opioids or narcotics, cocaine. You know, it's wild, even though it doesn't get you high, even though it has all these, you know, positive health benefits, and it's one of the oldest known cultivated plants that were utilized for these purposes. Like there is documentation of every indigenous people on the face of the planet cultivating industrial hemp for various purposes, going back even like 8,000 BC in
what's
China.
Wild to me is that, like, you're right, that like that is these schedules, But like Brandon McFadden and I just published a paper in Addictive Behaviors where we asked people about the like potential for abuse and basically tried to compare what the average American says about CBD, THC, hemp, marijuana versus what the schedule listing says about all of these things. And I mean, ultimately, the average American thinks that hemp / marijuana in general is less addictive and has more medical benefits than alcohol, for example, which I can get very easily.
Guys, I think I'm still the puritanical curmudgeon in this conversation, but I see, so y'all are talking about the benefits of hemp. You said you can grow it for grain, you can grow it for fiber, and then whatever CBD is. We have products for all of that stuff. And importantly, they don't come with these kind of increased risks, both to, if this stuff, the THC gets in, you gotta you've lost your crop from the perspective of the farmer, or it could have kind of unintended consequences on the consumer side of stuff. Why are those risks worth it from, I guess, both a farmer's perspective and a policymaker's perspective?
Well, look at you coming in with the curmudgeon $1 million question.
I mean, you're not wrong. I guess the way I think about a lot of this is it's all about prices, you know. So if there is an alternative product,
Trey, not exactly in this instance, right? Because the stuff we're talking about is unpriced risks.
Okay. I guess I mean, part of the problem.
You told me I'm not allowed to use the word externality on this.
No.
But it's an unpriced risk.
So an unpriced risk, but also it's because it's an unresearched risk. I think that at a minimum, you know, even if hemp or CBD or marijuana isn't like the future savior of the world, at a minimum, the idea that there is a massive amount of research that needs to be done to explore whether or not it could be one of the kind of big solutions to some of the big other unpriced risks that we see in the world, I think is at least worth exploring. And so this is where I think Christy was wanting to get to at some point in talking about carbon sequestration. Right. So we have these uses, right? So we have CBD, we have grains that we might be able to sell into the food market. And, you know, there is a lot of interest there. Fiber is the one that I know that, like, at least especially Kentucky, I think got super excited about, you know, looking at maybe the potential for fiber markets in CBD in hemp. But I would love to kind of spend a little bit of time talking for the rest of the time about the potential for hemp to serve as some type of an environmental solution. What do you think, Christy?
I think this actually kind of answers part of Alex's challenge there, his question. So why would you pursue this if there's an immature supply chain? Like, we don't know if we can sell your CBD industrial hemp. Right now, you know, the 2020 growing season just really opened up opportunities for people wanting to grow grain, because on the R&D side of things, what we're discovering is you can't perform, you know, the automotive industry can't utilize industrial hemp fiber based plastics without the research, right? They have to go through the all of the testing and all the safety regulations, everything that's associated with that. Like the standard in bar is extremely high. So in order to be able to start plugging in that supply chain, we need an R&D amount of material produced by the farmers to make that happen. So 2020 started the shift, getting people's heads out of the CBD craze and into these other markets. And so if I could create grain that could feed into these livestock studies and all over the US, whether it be in the rangelands or whether it be, you know, in a CAFO environment or whatever, we need to know, what does it do to a cow? What does it do to a hog? What does it do for poultry? Is there efficiencies that we can find there? Because the nature of that protein and fatty acid chain is extremely complete. It's one of the most complete, fatty acid chains that we can consume. There's very few things that operate at that level of completeness. So if we can produce that cost effectively and plug that into the livestock supply chain, we may be talking about totally, totally new markets here. And so therefore, that's what 2020 looked like. There were still the guys creating the CBD without any promise of anybody being able to buy it. I did a lot of coaching when people are like, what should I do? And I'm like, don't grow it. Don't grow it. I mean, and that's a very strange conversation for me to be able to have with people, because I'm out here advocating for industrial hemp and I'm telling people not to grow it. But part of that is because you have to be able to pallet a financial risk there and be willing to put up a crop that you may never get paid for.
Well, I guess, I think about, so Alex is like, the externality conversation is an important one.
Yeah.
This idea that there are these things out there that maybe we're not seeing represented in the price of the market. But that's true about all things in any market.
Well, in different ways. Fair enough. But you can't say, you can't just throw that out in corn and then hemp. So for the other row crops, that's a. I mean,
we can have plenty of easy externality conversations about corn, just like we can for anything else.
Well, let's do that one. The environmental, because the environmental conversation.
That's exactly where I'm
Christy,
going.
you were hinting at that
I'm
yesterday.
getting there.
Was fascinating.
I'm getting there, because it was only with the need, the market demands to expand into these other areas with an R&D quantity of industrial hemp products. And when I say products, I do not mean a CBD tincture. I'm talking about biomass harvested out of the field. Right. And so we needed some grain. We also have extrusion companies, companies that are supplying the automotive market or supplying, these other plastics industries, companies like the Dart company, who makes our Solo cups, Lego. Yeah, right. Lego, if you have kids, your kids put together little, creations with these Lego blocks. Lego made a public statement 2 years ago that they want to have X amount of percentage of their plastics, plant-based derived. And although we can get plastic polymers derived from other cropping systems, there is something very unique about the industrial hemp plant that allows us to derive these polymers and create more. And there's also, in doing that and harvesting that material, it's capturing carbon. It grows very quickly. It produces a lot of biomass, and it sequesters a ton of carbon. And so is it competitive with, say, a tree? Of course it is, but a tree takes 30 to 40 years to do that.
Well, and like we're seeing with federal policy right now, there's been this massive push to do more carbon sequestration, whether it be carbon markets, or we're trying to figure out how to deal with climate change from an agricultural perspective. And I think it could be possible that hemp is in the mix for trying to have that conversation in a more efficient way, even with corn, right? Like as maybe in the rotation, people start thinking about hemp as something that does all of these positive things that maybe we do incentivize a little bit more.
Right. And I think that there's a lot of inventiveness when it comes to what other things can we do with this plant material, because it has some really unique other properties that make it very attractive for the construction industry, right? Harvesting parts of that plant, the interior of that stem, that plant looks very different for fiber and grain. It's much more akin to, say, somewhere between like canola and sugarcane. Okay. It puts on some biomass, it puts on some leaf tissue, it puts on a tremendous grain head. If I'm growing specifically for fiber, I may not need to allow that grain to mature. I don't necessarily need that. So I want my energy to stay in my biomass production. So there's that, how do we harvest it? How do we bale it? How do we dry it? How do we take it? Who do we take it to? Because I can't take it uptown to the elevator. The elevator doesn't take hemp.
True. Yeah, right.
Just as a clarifying question for me, is hemp a perennial?
You're gonna know it's an annual. You're gonna plant it.
Okay.
You're gonna plant it every single year, and in some geographies you can plant 2 or 3 turns in a course of a growing season. Somewhere in that 90 to 120 day maturity is what you would need for that particular crop. There's autoflowers that have a shorter maturity, but that's more cannabinoid production oriented, not necessarily grain and fiber at all. More of a full season crop.
So on my thought about like maybe the potential for hemp being in the rotation for people when we're starting to deal with some of these carbon issues, is there a taboo that you like have seen with growers that are like, I would never grow hemp, it doesn't matter because it's, you know, against my...
They're puritanical curmudgeons like me.
Yes.
I would think, I think the cannabinoid had a lot of, cannabinoid production has a lot of that taboo. You know, there's still like that tongue in cheek, is this the new Cheech and Chong, like, you know, kind of deal. And some of that is generational. You know, I feel like those millennial age farmers that have come back to the farm, they maybe went away to school or they've done internships different places. Now they're back on the farm and involved in the decision-making tree or process. I feel like they're much more open to different ways to generate income on the farm outside of the traditional corn, soybean, sugar beet rotation. So industrial hemp has been a topic of conversation, and that is, in my consulting capacity, is what I've done a lot of, is helping them flesh out whether this is going to fit into their program.
This is also going to be a dumb, weird question. How much of your job is trying to be friends with the millennial trying to convince his dad that hemp is a choice that they should consider? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like that, because there's this intergenerational farm transfer problem that I think everybody who's ever talked to any farmer knows about. That like you always have the kid that comes home from college or whatever and is like, I've got these new ideas, and the elder farmer usually is like, well, it's not going to work. So do you feel like that's part of your responsibility in your role as a consultant, to kind of step in and help that millennial farmer make a case?
I mean, I don't have like a pitch deck on that specifically.
Yeah.
But that does occasionally come up. And I find that as the farms have grown larger, right? I mean, this is just a progression over time. Our farms are larger and larger than they ever were. There's this like concept of, if we farm more acres, then we should be making more money. And that isn't always true. And so what I find more interesting, or I engage more on, is asking them where they see the farm. And, because I'm not a financial consultant, but this speaks directly to the financial sustainability of your farm, right? Like if you're not in business next year, you don't need me at all. I need farmers to stay in business so that I can play my role in the production system. So yeah, occasionally that does come up. I mean, it's not very often. Usually when somebody's already entertaining industrial hemp, it's because somebody or some trade publication has already done the favor of introducing that as an option. And so then I get brought in to talk real talk about how this works.
This generational part of farming, I think, is a really interesting thing that's worth exploring when we start talking about niche crops.
Yeah.
Because I think, at least when I think about like old school farmers, I think about my granddad, and my granddad goes to the co-op every single Wednesday, and he gets his donuts, and that's where he gets most of his agronomic information, from his co-op buddies on Wednesdays at donuts. And so like I have a hard time imagining my granddad and his co-op buddies buying into hemp, no matter what the outcome of the crop is, because for their whole life we've been talking about how like marijuana, hemp, Cheech and Chong, whatever, is not something that people like them should be participating in. At the same time, like I know a lot of my friends who went to Oklahoma State with me, they went home to the farm and they're willing to try some weird stuff. They're willing to think about maybe some different profit maximizing opportunities. Right. And so I know for a fact that that's a conflict that they have all the time. It might not necessarily be hemp, but there is a conflict that exists. And so I envision a lot of your job to be like trying to show people that there is a profitable way forward in this, or maybe there isn't, but at least it's worth considering.
I think where I come into the conversation is helping them to find adaptation, right? So this is what we're currently set up to do, or this is what we're currently doing. I have 2 clients that are utilizing industrial hemp on their farm for the sole express purpose of soil recovery. Like they're not harvesting this for any other reason. They're not, the whole purpose for this on their particular farm is to add root diversity to their cover crop program. And so in very small quantities, small percentages, blended in with other, seeded things or seeded into an established cover of some kind, to hit the multiplier, the exponential multiplier on soil recovery, whether that be soil aggregation, like the actual soil structure itself, or whether that be remediating. The industrial hemp plant is a tremendous bioremediator. They're utilizing it in places like Fukushima, Japan, to recover soils that were damaged from a nuclear release.
Christy, is that true?
That is facts. That's facts.
That is so cool. That's a great story.
Right. So, and there's also, places in the Ukraine that were remnants of the USSR's nuclear programs that were decommissioned and had leakage or damage over time. They're utilizing this to sequester that, converting those radioactive isotopes into things that are more benign, and recovering the soil. This is a plant that can be cultivated in quite literally all of the climates that we're growing plants on the face of the planet. And so it has a tremendous amount of diversity there. So there's
a minimum potential, right? So like that's the thing. Right now, I just feel like we don't know. Like we have this idea of what we might be able to do with this crop, but we don't know yet.
Right.
And so it blows my mind to think about how far we've come since I met you, right? Like in those 3 years, we've come leaps and bounds in the middle of the craziest 3-year period in my life, aside from hemp. And so like how cool is it to think that maybe 10 years from now we're having this conversation about like all of the environmental benefits that the hemp research has really unveiled to the world, which I think is just nuts. It's super cool.
I think one of the overarching goals, I think, of ag in general is to do some myth busting that farmers don't care about the environment. And so I think that industrial hemp can actually serve a really valuable purpose in giving farmers some good press. Okay. And for me, I've done the research on the root architecture and these different styles of roots within the same plant. Just its nature in and of itself lends it to be very valuable. If I don't have any other cover crop on my farm except some wild industrial hemp, my soil test is going to be improved. My soil biological potential is improved. My my ability to cycle nutrients and keep it captured into the plant is improved. The implications of those things are absolutely mind-blowing.
That's super exciting.
It is. That's what inspires me the most, honestly.
So what do you see as the big headwinds, like moving forward for hemp?
I think this trunk, this vein that we're talking about right here, I think is going to continue to propel hemp into circles and conversations that are oriented to environmental objectives. I know that for me, I think is really exciting because I work with a lot of producers that, they've made observations. Boy, it's not producing like it once was. We're still getting, technically speaking, good yields relatively against our county averages. But I remember back, Dad used to pasture cattle there and that kind of thing. Well, over time, our soil quality has suffered to a degree. As our technology has improved and our pest management tools have improved, we've sort of forgotten about some old practices. And so in some regards, we're pulling something out of the closet here. We're pulling an old tool off the shelf that's been dusty for 80 plus years. And we're going to blow the cobwebs off and we're going to start implementing this in different ways. And I love to work with farmers who are open to soil recovery approaches, right? That's my language. I want to focus on soil quality.
Everybody absolutely talks about soil health. Absolutely. It's top of mind for so many people right now.
It open up any trade journal in the ag industry, and that's, you can find at least 5 articles related to soil health. And so I feel like the soil health component of what industrial hemp brings to the table is tremendous, and I think it's going to play a really pivotal role in like I said, the multipliers for soil recovery, nutrient capture, and I'd love to be able to be a part of projects that are moving that needle even more so than the plastics part, or even more so than the human consumption for grain, and way more than CBD. So for
You're
me,
over
those are
CBD.
real opportunities.
If there's one thing that I've taken away from this, like, you don't think CBD is the future for hemp. Fair?
I don't think CBD is going away. I think we're producing enough CBD for us to have to like not worry about it anymore. The people that are doing it well, let them. You know, let them produce it in places where it's perfectly geared to keep our nation supplied with what we need. You know, the regulatory components of that have been really muddy, and it's really held things up for so long that it's time to move on and keep moving forward, right? We're not going to get anywhere by not moving forward. And so for me, this is where it's at. This is the direction it's going. And I don't know anybody in the hemp industry that would disagree with me right now.
Any other thoughts, Aleks?
I think that's great. I think we should end it right now. That was a spirited high note. I think we should go with that.
We don't get to end on very many high notes.
This is like our only episode where we get to end on a happy, hopeful way.
Like, how awesome is it that you like, there's this like random thing that we used to do in the United States or in the world, and then we didn't do it for a while, and now it could actually be one of the parts of the solution. That's cool.
Right.
So, well, awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, Christy. This was really fun. I honestly, I really appreciate when you took me out on the hemp farm. You know, someday when we can all do like social normal things again, like I would love to go back out to some of those same farms, or at least some other farm, to see kind of what their experiences have been in the last 3 years. You're doing like really awesome stuff. Anybody watching, totally worth the follow at a minimum, just because she's everywhere. And like I said, you don't know what you're going to get, but you're going to get some type of information almost every day, honestly. So thanks for joining, Christy.
Thank you so much for having me. As you can tell, I'm passionate about this, not just this crop, but really moving the ag industry forward, and it's exciting to be a part of that. I'm glad to have been able to build a niche here, and thank you for the ability to reach your audience and the great questions. Appreciate you guys.
Great.
Thanks so much. Take care, y'all.
Bye.